I would like to introduce Chad Baumann of Baumann DeGroot Heating and Cooling. Chad is a lifelong resident of Holland. He went to Holland Christian and left us for a short time to go to Calvin College. He has a lifetime experience in the heating and cooling business, and as you can tell by his last name, he's in the family businesses, which is part of the reason why he's very personal and passionate about what he does, and because these are his neighbors that he wants to help out and educate about one of the largest energy-consuming devices in people's homes. Chad.
All right, that's quite the introduction. Yeah, third generation tin knocker, so it's been in the blood for a while, but tried my hand at a couple of other things after college, but ended up coming back to heating and cooling because it's just one of those things that I know. So even when I was at my other jobs, I constantly had people coming up to me asking me questions about heating and cooling in their house. And so at some point in time, it just made logical sense to move back and do something I knew what I was doing. So today we're talking about furnace tune-ups. The city of Holland is pushing those right now as a way to conserve energy, and it's something easy. And our company actually put out a couple of coupons out there. If you're in the city of Holland, you do get a special on those. So please take advantage of those. So when our techs show up to do a tune-up at a customer's house, we are looking at a number of things. The first and foremost is air filters. I'm sure our guys and I, when I show up, we sound like a dentist who's nagging people about flossing. Too often we're pulling out air filters that are dirty, plugged, and just have debris in them. That right there is the easiest thing that you guys can do as homeowners to conserve energy and to prolong the life expectancy of your equipment. When you have a plugged filter, it's the same thing as you trying to breathe. I mean, I pulled out a couple of dirty filters and handed it to somebody and it's like, here, you try and breathe out of this. And you get like the look on their face like, you expect me to put my face up to that? Well, I mean, that's what's in your house, and that's what the air inside your house is moving through. So it's both disgusting because you've got dirt and dust stuck in there, but at the same time, all that debris is really constricting the airflow going to your furnace. You're making your furnace run extra hard trying to pull the air through there. And if you have an old style blower motor, which we'll kind of dive into a little bit, a PSC motor, it uses a magnet to spin, and it actually starts slipping because it's trying so hard to try and pull that air through. You're going to burn out your motor extra quick, and at the same time, you're not putting enough air past your heat exchanger, so your heat exchanger is going to start running extra hot, and over time could cause a premature failure. So air filters, I'm going to try and hammer that home. Air filters are a must. A good rule of thumb for like peak usage, like in the winter and the summer, for every inch in width your filter is, should be how many months it goes in between changing. So if you have just a 1 inch by 16 by 20 or 16 by 25, in the dead of winter right now when your furnace is running near nonstop, about once a month. I mean, 3M and stuff like that, who you might buy through Myers or Menards or something like that, they'll push like 3 months. That's a little extreme, and we strongly recommend just keeping an eye on it. So a 2-inch filter, 2 months, 4-inch or 5-inch filter should be about 4 months, and you can get media filters, which are very, very good at pulling small particles out of the air. Those can go up to a full year. So if you're not responsible and can't stay on top of your filter changes, it's really a very good way to kind of bypass that. If you're responsible for changing it just once, almost every homeowner can stay on top of that. And it also is very, very beneficial because it pulls out the smallest particles of dust, dirt, viruses, and bacteria even.
So are those more expensive filters that they're selling, are they worth it?
They are.
Okay.
Because if you're replacing a 1-inch filter, 12 times, well, in the fall and in the spring when your system's not running very much, you can stretch out a 1-inch filter to 3 months. Mm-hmm. It's just that peak operating. So if you have a 1-inch filter, I would recommend that you'd be changing it somewhere between 6 and 8 times a year. Mm-hmm. And so roughly speaking, about $6 a piece, you're at about $48 for a year for all filters. A media At least the ones that we sell by our shop, April Air, I think we charge $55. So you're paying an extra $7 for a far superior filter. The next step in our furnace tune-up is we vacuum and wipe down the entire furnace. A lot of times, especially if the furnace has been neglected for a long period of time, they accumulate a lot of dust and dirt, spider webs, stuff like that. And as your exhaust motor and your blower motor are moving, they're stirring that up, and that can, those will get caught in the burners, those will get caught in the motors, and those will cause those motors to run extra hot and burn up quickly and use more energy. So if you guys are trying to do this at home, it's really not a bad idea to just take a shop vac. Just vacuum out the inside of the furnace, wipe it down, just try and make it look as nice and neat as possible. If it passes the clean test or the glove test, that's good. I mean, it's not going to be a huge energy saver, but it's going to go a long ways towards keeping your system running for the long period of time. The next step.
Another question.
Yes.
Is that something you recommend every year if we called Richardson or another company come in as a tune-up? Is that a yearly thing or every other year?
As a salesman, I would love to be in your house every year, but as a realist, the newer your furnace is, the longer you can go in between checkups. A brand new furnace generally has like a minimum of a 2-year labor warranty plus all the parts warranties. So for the first 2 years, if we were to install a system, I wouldn't expect to go in there. You're not getting a very good value when we show up within 2 years. After 2 years, I recommend somewhere between year 3 and 5, having somebody come in, just clean it up. The likelihood of us finding anything as far as weak parts or stuff that are going out is slim, but it's still good to get a clean bill of health, get it all cleaned up and wiped down. And then between year 5 and 10, I'd recommend every other year, and then as soon as you hit year 10, do it every year. So the next step is we clean and adjust your burners. So furnaces now have 2 types of burners. The most common one is going to be a fired or a jet burner. It's just a little cone, and it sprays gas through there, and it mixes with air, and then it combusts on the other side of these cones. The more common through the 80s and up to the 90s, and you still see a couple of them today, they're just not, they're not used quite as much, are the ribbon burners. And the gas gets shot through here, and you can see just very lightly all the little slits in there, and that's where the gas comes up and combusts. Now, the jet fired burners, those are pretty hard to gum up and clean. I mean, you're dealing with a hole about a couple of centimeters in diameter. And those generally are pretty maintenance-free. The ribbon burners, on the other hand, have a tendency to corrode over time, and they can collect, and you can see kind of the difference between a new one on the bottom and one pulled out on the top, and you can see how that corrosion starts taking place. And if you have a ribbon-style burner, it is very, very helpful to pull those out maybe every 5 years and just use a wire brush and really, really scrape those clean so that the gas can get through and combust efficiently.
Chad?
Yes?
Is it safe to say if it is kind of corroded that it'll cost you more money?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's not
absolutely. I mean,
burning
your consumption is going to be a lot higher because you're not burning very efficiently at that point in time. So you're using more resources, more gas, to get the same amount of heat when you're burning on a very corroded ribbon burner as opposed to a nice clean open one.
How do we know which kind we have?
If you take the top door off your furnace, and let's go back to a nice little diagram and we can kind of do a little walkthrough here. If you take the top door off, generally, unless you have a counterflow furnace where most furnaces are in the upright position, blowing up. And so if you take the top door off, you'll see, especially if it's running, you'll see you can pinpoint exactly where the flames are. And so on a newer furnace up here, like these carriers, you do have all the jet or the fired burners, and you can just see the cones. And they're very, very clear to see. Very few furnaces actually have them locked up anymore. Some of the older furnaces are in a sealed combustion, but they will have a viewing glass where you can actually observe your flame. So if you're curious, you can just pull the top door off and just take a look during when it's running. Let's take a look here. We check your blower for balance. Slang term for those are squirrel cages. And the blower is it's a direct driven motor, and it's hard to describe. It's easier to show, and it's not a very clear picture here. But it is it's a wheel, and it's got the metal basically peeled up, and it just grabs the air and there we go. Thank you. I appreciate the help there. So those vanes have a tendency to collect dust and dirt, especially if your filter's been out for any amount of time. If you're a subsequent homeowner, you don't have no idea how well the previous homeowners stayed up to date on their filter changes, or if they used a filter at all. And so at that point in time, if you have no filter to pull the dust out of the air, you'll have a big tendency to accumulate all that dust and dirt on the vanes. And once those vanes plug up, it's not grabbing the air and pushing it through your furnace anymore. And so your furnace is your blower is gonna just run and run and run, and you're not pushing any air. So your efficiency is drastically reduced. Your furnace is gonna be running extra hot, your air conditioner is gonna be running extra cold, and it's gonna cost you a lot of money in the long run, both in resources and utility bills, as well as replacing or repairing all your equipment. So that is a big key thing. We always take a look at that, and we should start keeping a diary of horror stories, because there are some that would make your skin crawl, where the techs bring some stuff back and you get the rubber gloves out because it's that bad. But yes, sir.
So is that something, you talked about us vacuuming and wiping them down. Is that something we can access? Sorry.
You can access it. The degree of difficulty there starts climbing up a little bit, because there's wiring that you have to take off from the motor itself, and then there's usually 2 screws that's holding it in place. So you have to take the 2 screws out. You slide the entire blower out of the bottom, and then you've got anywhere between 3 and 8 wires going back to the control board. And if you're really good with wiring, anytime I take a blower off, even though I've got experience, I still snap a picture of the wiring before I start pulling wires off. There's nothing worse than all of a sudden sitting there going, I need to start from scratch, and I need to figure out where each wire goes, because even with experience, it takes a little bit of time. So I guess the long story short, I wouldn't recommend it, but yes, you could do that with usually a 1/4-inch nut driver. Yes?
While you have that up, can you show me where I can find the year of the furnace? Because I moved recently.
Sure. Generally, on the inside of a furnace, every furnace is a little bit different, but probably in 70% of the applications, if you take the top door off, on the inside of the furnace here, you'll have a sticker with all the information. And if the manufacturer was nice, they put a nice manufacturer date on there. Generally not, and so you'll have to use the serial number to figure out what date is. And everybody except for Trane and Lennox has just a real nice, easy way to track that. And so if your furnace is not a Trane or a Lennox, generally the first 4 numbers indicate the week and the year that it was manufactured. So it would be like 4214, so the 42nd week of 2014. So that would be an easy way to track that down. But if you have a Trane or a Lennox, unfortunately, you'll have to go online, because they have it in a code, and that code changes from model to model. It's infuriating. The next thing that we'll look for, if it's an 80% furnace, and I'll kind of cover the difference between a 90 and an 80. 80% furnaces use metal venting coming out of them, and that metal venting has a tendency to corrode over time, and that corrosion flakes off and falls into the furnace, and that can make its way into the inducer motor or the exhaust motor that's moving exhaust gases. And if that gets plugged up too much, you will occasionally have a high limit fault or in your inducer motor, which isn't a huge consumer of electricity, but that will be working very inefficiently because it's trying to pull through all that gunk and debris. Thermostat. Almost every single thermostat out there has batteries of some sort. And like last week, it's not a great feeling to show up to somebody's house and change out 2 batteries and invoice them for it. So stay up to date on your batteries. Change those out once a year. I mean, it's not a huge saver of energy or efficiency, but your thermostat will start acting a little wonky and will start dropping out if it doesn't have good, strong batteries. And so that's an easy way to avoid a service call.
Change your fire, smoke detectors at the same time you do your furnace.
That'd be a good, yes.
I've seen people want to save energy and they'll like close off a vent in some rooms. Does that actually save energy, or does it use more energy? Or?
It doesn't do much as far as saving energy. You'll generally close off a register if you have an imbalance in the house. If you've got rooms in most 2-story houses, especially older houses that you'll see in the city of Holland, ductwork is extremely inadequate for a 2-story house back even before the 90s. Even in the 90s, we were still struggling trying to figure out how to size 2-story houses as far as ductwork goes. Heat, thankfully, has a tendency to rise, and so it's not a big deal in the winter. But in the summer, I'm sure a lot of people with 2-story houses can attest to it's impossible to cool a 2-story house in the summer. And so what you'll see when you start closing registers is basically you are forcing more air, because air is always going to take the path of least resistance. And so on the main floor where it's pretty easy to cool, you might close a register or 2 in like the main den or living area. And by doing that, you're restricting the airflow there and you're making it easier for the air to find its way to the upstairs. And so that is generally why you would close a register. It doesn't do as much as far as energy efficiency, but it does go a long ways towards balancing the house and trying to get heat or cool in areas that you need.
Well, I have an old house, and the only cold air return is out in the hallway. And so I close off 2 rooms that I just don't use.
Well, cold air returns, you want to leave those open.
Right,
At
that's
all.
open. I'm just
Okay.
saying that there's 2 rooms that I just don't use, so I close the registers and
Okay.
just heat the rest of it. Does
Yep.
that make a difference?
Yeah,
It seemed like it
if
would.
you're not using the rooms, yeah, absolutely. But there is a thing is closing too many registers.
Right.
2 rooms isn't a big deal,
Mhm.
but if you close more than a quarter of the registers in your house, then you'll start bottling heat up on top of the furnace, and that's gonna hurt you in the long run. Thermostat programming is a big one, and we don't program people's thermostats for them because everybody's different, but we do offer that while we're there. Older houses with poor insulation, they should be programmed, but you have to be, a lot of people have this concept that if they drop their temperature 10, 15 degrees at night or when they're gone, they're saving a lot of energy. The problem is, especially on days like today where we have a very strong negative wind chill, your furnace just can't keep up. When it's negative 20 when I woke up this morning, the best you can hope for is that your furnace can maintain temperature. Asking it to gain any temperature, any degrees in this kind of weather, it's not going to happen. So we've dealt with a couple of calls where people are saying, hey, my furnace has been running for 4 hours and it's only gained 3 degrees. That's normal on a day like today. So generally a 5-degree difference is as drastic as we'd recommend for dropping it at night or during while you're gone. I mean, if you're gone for 12 hours during the day, feel free to drop it a little bit more. But if it's 6 to 7 hours, 5 degrees is about max, or else you're going to start losing the energy efficiency of that. So the final thing is a visual inspection of the heat exchanger. I'm sure everybody's heard the horror stories of heat exchanger cracks and everything like that. What a heat exchanger is it's a sealed metal tube essentially. So after the flames kick in on the burners, it travels through a series of tubes, and basically there's a lot of bends through these tubes. You're basically trying to trap this heat in this sealed container as long as you can, so that as the air is moving past the sealed container, the air is picking up that heat. And The key word there is sealed. You don't want exhaust gases mixing with the air flowing through your house. And so this heat exchanger, what we're seeing in a high efficiency is we have a primary and a secondary heat exchanger. So the exhaust gases, which are burning at 400 to 500 degrees, are traveling through, and this primary heat exchanger is very, very wide open, usually about 1.5 inch tubes. And it's got about 3 bends here, and then you can see it kind of zigzags a little bit. It's restricting that flow as much as possible. And then it enters the secondary heat exchanger, where all of a sudden you're going down to very, very minute tubes and capillaries that zigzag further and further. And so when you say that you have a 96.3% efficient furnace, at that point in time, 96.3% of all that heat that you're producing is staying inside your house, and only roughly 3.5% of that is actually moving to the outside of the house. And so you want to maintain the integrity of that heat exchanger, because once you have a crack, it's a huge safety issue. It's not necessarily poisonous if the heat exchanger cracks, because if your furnace is still burning clean, you're not producing a ton of carbon monoxide, but it's still something that needs to be addressed immediately, because if it does burn foul even for a little bit, it is a huge health hazard. So as soon as your heat exchanger is compromised, the heat exchanger needs to be replaced, or it needs to be, the entire furnace needs to be replaced ASAP.
How would you
What
notice
would be
if there
the
was a crack?
symptoms?
Yeah.
Okay, so our guys, we do basic visual inspection. Because it's supposed to be sealed, a flame looks very nice and straight, and you can see a good burning flame. As soon as you have a crack when your blower motor kicks on, so you've got a sealed container in that air, when the blower motor kicks on, there should be no effect on the flame whatsoever, because it's completely sealed off from the air moving through the house. If there's a crack, you can start to see the flame start to wobble a little bit, because that blower motor is forcing air into the heat exchanger. And so our guys are trained to look for that immediately. And if they see even a little bit of a wobble, yes sir, if we see even a little wobble, then we know that we need to take a closer look. And then we have a variety of stuff as low tech as just a flashlight and mirror and a expandable mirror. And we have stuff like a snake camera that we can slide through there, and we can take a close look. And there's also a combustion analyzer. We'll turn the furnace on, and we can put a probe into your exhaust, and then it gives a full readout of your exhaust gases, the temperature, the composition, oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. And with that, we can tell a compromised heat exchanger very quickly.
Are there symptoms that I as a homeowner would know though, prior to having to call you to see?
If it's bad, yes. Your furnace will trip out on high limit generally. If there's a crack, it'll cause flame rollout. And there are safety sensors installed in every single furnace to avoid a hazardous situation. And so if your furnace dies out for whatever reason, then at that point in time, it's a good idea to give us a call so that we can come out and we can take a look. And sometimes it's something simple, just like a flame sensor, but other times, especially if your furnace is getting to the 15-year plus range, it's very, very advised to give an expert a call just to take a closer look.
Or physical symptoms that someone might sense in their home? Would I get a headache or something?
Possibly. So carbon monoxide is nothing to sneeze at. It's very dangerous, odorless. And exactly. If you are waking up, if you're sluggish, you've got headaches, nauseous, those are all signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. It's very rare with the construction of furnaces nowadays to get that, but if you have an older, like 1960s lowboy or something like that, it's not quite as uncommon, and those can burn very foul, and they don't push enough air, and so that carbon monoxide can very, very easily collect and cause health issues. So please keep throwing questions at me. I'm about at the end of what I was planning on talking about, but
This is a little bit off the mark
Sure.
on just furnaces, but a ventless versus a vented furnace, is there any difference in efficiency in those types of furnaces?
all furnaces are vented. There's
But
no.
I'm speaking of the kind that you have to vent out of the chimney versus one that you would install and you
Okay.
can vent it to the side of the house?
So that is the difference between an 80% furnace and a 90% furnace. An 80% furnace lacks that secondary heat exchanger, and so only 80% of the heat is actually staying in the house. And because of that, you've got 20% heat is still very, very hot, and there's enough heat to carry that up and out of your house in it before it condenses.
Okay.
Whereas a high efficiency, a 90+% furnace, at 10%, there's not enough heat to get it out of the house, and so it starts to condense as it's traveling through those pipes, and it creates water. And you can't have water in a metal pipe,
Right.
or else it's going to corrode out in about 2 years. And so that's why you see PVC venting with all new furnaces nowadays, because you have to account for the water.
Gotcha.
That kind of wraps it up.
Oh.
My boss has informed me we need to be prompt when we end, but maybe Chad can stick around a little bit if you have any more questions.
Sure.
Chad, thank you for your presentation.